What I'd like to do now is to talk about biological molecules. So biological molecules are molecules that are very common in living organisms, such as the human. There are four major groups of biological molecules: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. And each of them has a different role in the human body. So first we'll talk about carbohydrates. Carbo means carbon and hydrate means oxygen and hydrogen. So carbohydrates happen to be biological molecules that contain lots of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now a lot of times when we look at pictures of carbohydrates, the people get a little lazy in the drawings and they stop drawing all of the atoms. So they might not draw all the carbons and the hydrogens or all of the oxygens. And that's what we're seeing in the pictures here on the screen. The atoms are implied. And many times carbohydrates are drawn as like a hexagon or a pentagon, as we see here in the pictures. Familiar examples of carbohydrates include things like glucose, which is also known as blood sugar, and starch. So carbohydrates can come in a simple form or in a complex form. So a simple carbohydrate, which is called a monosaccharide, would include something like glucose. It's a single sugar unit. But if you take single sugar units and you put them together, you get what we call a polysaccharide. So the most important monosaccharide or simple carbohydrate in the human body is glucose. Glucose is very important for energy. It is our main source for making cellular energy. Now, we use the energy in glucose to make cellular energy, which is in the form of ATP. And I'll talk more about ATP in a little bit when we talk about nucleic acids. When it comes to the complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides, the important one in the human body is something called glycogen. So glycogen is really just a whole bunch of glucose molecules connected one to another. It's very similar to the starch polysaccharide shown on the screen here. Glycogen is very important for storing energy in the human body. Your liver will store glycogen, and your heart muscle and your skeletal muscles also store glycogen for energy. And when that energy is needed, the glycogen is broken down into glucose, and then the glucose is broken down to obtain energy to make ATP. Next up are the lipids. And the lipids are kind of joined together in a group because they have large components that are hydrophobic. Most lipids are almost entirely hydrophobic, but some of the lipids are partially hydrophobic and partially hydrophilic. So lipids include things such as triglycerides, which we see up here at the top. A triglyceride is named for the fact that it has 3 fatty acids attached to it. So the fatty acids are long chains of carbons and hydrogens. And the triglyceride is really important for storing energy in the human body. Now earlier I was talking about glycogen as a carbohydrate that's used to store energy. We can also store energy in the human body with fat. So triglycerides serve that purpose. So our fat tissue that we might not love so much, it stores lots of triglyceride energy for us. Next up in the lipid category are phospholipids, which we see here in the center of the screen. The triglyceride had 3 fatty acid chains, 3 chains of carbons and hydrogens. The phospholipid only has 2. And in place of the 3rd fatty acid chain, it has a component that contains phosphate, which is a group containing phosphorus and oxygen, which we can see here. So a phospholipid is very important in the human body because it helps us to form the outer layer to our cells called the cell membrane. So the main component to the cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, so 2 layers of these phospholipids. The phospholipid is both hydrophobic and hydrophilic, and there's a special term for that called amphipathic. And the fact that the phospholipid is amphipathic is what allows it to form the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane. And we'll talk more about these when we get to our unit on cells. Another group in the lipid category are steroids. So steroids they look very different from triglycerides and phospholipids, as you can see here at the bottom of the screen. We don't have any fatty acid chains in a steroid, okay? But we do have these hexagon type structures connected to each other. Right? What makes a steroid a lipid is the fact that it is very hydrophobic. Right? Steroids include things like cholesterol, estrogen, and testosterone. So estrogen and testosterone are hormones that are actually derived from cholesterol. Not all hormones are lipids, and I guess I should probably define a hormone. It's a term you've probably heard before. Right? A hormone is a chemical messenger used in the human body for communication. We have different types of chemical messengers we can use in the human body. Neurotransmitters are also a chemical messenger used in the human body, but they're different from hormones. And what makes them different is how they might be released and how they're being used. So hormones tend to be chemical messengers that travel far distances, often traveling through the bloodstream. And not all hormones are made from lipids, but some are. An example of a hormone that's not made from a lipid is insulin, which comes from a protein. Now, as I've been talking about lipids, I've mentioned the term fatty acid. And it's a term you're probably familiar with because you've heard maybe information about fatty acids as applied to nutrition, right? So maybe you've heard of saturated fats and unsaturated fats. So these are terms that are applied to these long chains of carbons and hydrogens, these fatty acid chains, right? And saturation is referring to how much hydrogen is present in the carbon-hydrogen chain. If the fatty acid contains all of the hydrogen that it possibly can contain, we call that a saturated fat. But if the chain could possibly take on more hydrogen, then we would call that an unsaturated fat. Okay? And these two fatty acids are different structurally and functionally in the human body. There's still a lot of unknowns and still a lot of research going on with regards to our diet and the role that these particular fatty acids play in our diet. But generally speaking, diets high in saturated fats put us at risk for certain diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, stroke, and other conditions too.